Inside any criminal organization that moves serious weight, there is one rule that sits above every other rule. Do not steal from the organization. Not a percentage, not a package, not a dollar. The reasoning is not purely moral, it is operational. A drug trafficking operation runs on trust, and trust in that world is not built through goodwill. It is built through the absolute certainty that betrayal has a known and immediate consequence. The moment that certainty weakens, every person in the organization starts calculating whether they can get away with the same thing. The penalty for stealing is not set at the level of the crime itself. It is set at the level of what would happen if the crime were allowed to stand unchallenged. The four men in this story understood that calculation completely. What they did when they discovered stolen product in their organizations reveals something specific and disturbing about how power works at the highest levels of the drug trade, and why the people who built those empires were willing to kill the people closest to them when the money went missing. Ismael Zambada. Ismael Zambada Garcia has spent more than 5 decades as one of the most powerful figures in Mexican drug trafficking without ever serving a significant prison sentence, an achievement so unusual in his field that it has made him a subject of fascination among law enforcement analysts who study long-term cartel leadership. He was born in 1948 in the Sinaloa Highlands, grew up working as a farmer and small-time produce seller before gravitating toward the trade that would make him one of the wealthiest and most feared men in the Western Hemisphere. By the time the Sinaloa cartel emerged as the dominant trafficking organization in Mexico, Zambada was one of its primary architects, operating in partnership with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman as co-leader of an enterprise that the United States Department of Justice has described as the largest drug trafficking organization in the world. His longevity is not accidental. Where El Chapo cultivated a public persona that made him simultaneously famous and vulnerable to capture, Zambada operated in deliberate obscurity, rarely photographed, rarely seen at events where law enforcement might position surveillance, insulated by layers of intermediaries between himself and the street-level operations his organization controlled. He bought protection at the institutional level with payments to law enforcement officials, military figures, and political operatives that shielded the organization from the kind of sustained investigation that eventually brought down most of his contemporaries. But insulation from external threats does not protect an organization from internal ones. And in the specific case that revealed how Zambada handled betrayal within his own ranks, the threat came from family. According to evidence that emerged in subsequent legal proceedings, Zambada discovered that a family member who had been given authority to collect drug debts on behalf of the cartel had been keeping collected money for himself rather than delivering it to the organization. The position of debt collector within a drug trafficking operation is one of trust and close access, and the specific trust that had been extended here had been comprehensively violated. Zambada reportedly ordered the killing of his own nephew in response. The logic inside the cartel was the same logic that governs every enforcement decision in organizations like this one. The relationship to the individual was irrelevant. What was relevant was what allowing the theft to stand would communicate to every other person in the organization who was watching to see how the leadership responded to disloyalty. A nephew who steals and lives is an invitation for everyone else to test the boundaries. A nephew who steals and does not survive is a message. A separate incident documented in connection with Zambada's organization involved the discovery that a substantial shipment of cartel product had been stolen. The response was an organized effort to identify those responsible and execute them, treating the theft as a declaration of war against the organization, regardless of who had committed it or what their prior standing within the cartel had been. Missing product at scale was not treated as a business loss to be absorbed. It was treated as a capital offense, with capital punishment applied accordingly. Zambada himself was arrested in 2024 in a manner that generated significant controversy. He was brought to the United States in a private aircraft and appeared in a federal courthouse in Texas, where he was arraigned on charges related to his decades of cartel leadership. His arrest came under circumstances that his attorney immediately disputed, with claims that he had been deceived and transported against his will by former Sinaloa cartel co-leader Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son, who had allegedly arranged the encounter under false pretenses. The circumstances of his arrival in United States custody remain contested. What is not contested is the depth of the federal case against him, built from decades of investigation and the testimony of numerous cooperating witnesses. The portrait of Zambada that emerges from that case is of a man who combined genuine organizational sophistication with a total willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened the structure he had spent 50 years building, regardless of how personally close they were to him. Family loyalty, in his framework, was always conditional on organizational loyalty. When the two came into conflict, organizational loyalty won. Ryan Wedding. Ryan Wedding's story begins in a world that seems categorically removed from the Sinaloa Highlands or the streets of Harlem. He was a Canadian Olympic snowboarder who competed at the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Games before transitioning from competition into a criminal career that would eventually make him one of the most wanted men in Canada and the subject of a major international law enforcement investigation. His transition into drug trafficking was not immediate or public, but by the time Canadian and American investigators were building their case against him, Wedding had become a significant figure in cocaine trafficking between Mexico and Canada, operating under the alias El Jefe, a name that reflected both his self-perception and his organizational position. He had built a network that moved large quantities of product northward and had developed working relationships with Mexican suppliers that gave his operation consistent and high-volume access to cocaine. The specific incident that illustrates how Wedding operated when product went missing involved a cocaine shipment that had been stolen within his distribution network. The theft of a drug shipment at the level Wedding was operating is not a minor inconvenience. The financial stakes are measured in millions of dollars, and the reputational stakes within the trafficking community are measured in the perception of whether an organization has the capacity to protect its inventory and discipline its associates. According to the investigation that eventually produced charges against Wedding, he responded to the theft by ordering murders in Canada. Multiple individuals connected to the stolen shipment were killed. The murders were not impulsive or chaotic, but were characterized by investigators as targeted responses to a specific theft, with Wedding directing the violence from his position within the organization. By the time Canadian authorities had built a comprehensive case against him, Wedding had left Canada and was living in Mexico, placing himself outside the immediate reach of Canadian law enforcement. The United States Department of Justice indicted him in 2024 on charges that included drug trafficking and murder-related offenses, and he was added to the DEA's list of the most wanted drug traffickers. As of the time of that indictment, his precise location was unknown to authorities, though the investigation indicated he was believed to be in Mexico. What makes Wedding's case particularly striking within the broader subject of this story is the trajectory it represents. A man who stood on an Olympic podium in 2002, who had been publicly recognized at the highest level of competitive athletic achievement, built a criminal organization within the structure of international cocaine trafficking and then ordered people killed when that organization's inventory was stolen. The distance between those two versions of the same person is considerable, and the specific decision to respond to a stolen shipment with murder places Wedding squarely within the pattern that governs how serious trafficking organizations handle internal theft, regardless of where in the world they operate. The Canadian and American investigations that built the case against him required years of work across multiple jurisdictions, the kind of sustained law enforcement coordination that reflects how seriously both governments took the threat his organization represented. The murder charges embedded in the federal indictment are among the most serious a drug trafficking defendant can face, and they exist because when cocaine went missing in Wedding's network, the response was not a business adjustment, it was a killing. Frank Lucas built one of the most profitable heroin distribution operations in American history out of Harlem in the late 1960s and early 1970s, establishing a direct supply chain from Southeast Asia that bypassed the Italian-American organized crime infrastructure that had previously controlled the drug trade in New York and that had been extracting a tax from every level of the market below them. His operation, known by the brand name Blue Magic, moved heroin of a purity that the market had not previously seen, and it generated revenues that made Lucas one of the wealthiest men in Harlem. His organizational methods were particular. He ran his distribution network through family members recruited from North Carolina, his home state, and he maintained control through a combination of personal loyalty and the absolute certainty that disloyalty would be addressed without hesitation. He was not a figure who delegated violence to intermediaries and maintained a comfortable distance from its consequences. By his own account, he was directly involved in the enforcement decisions his organization required. The most frequently cited instance of Lucas ordering and executing punishment for theft involves a dealer known as Hollywood Dick Pearson. According to Lucas's own account, Pearson had been stealing from him, either through shorting the product he delivered, keeping money that was owed to Lucas, or some combination of both. Lucas has described in the interviews confronting Pearson about the theft, and when the matter was not resolved to his satisfaction, personally ending Pearson's life. It is important to be precise about what is known and what is not. The killing of Hollywood Dick Pearson exists in the historical record primarily through Frank Lucas's own testimony about his past, given in interviews and legal proceedings over the years. Lucas was not charged with Pearson's murder, and the account rests substantially on his own characterization of events. He has been candid in discussing his violent past in ways that serve his preferred narrative of himself as a man who was genuinely dangerous when crossed, and this specific story functions within that narrative as evidence of what stealing from Frank Lucas costs. What is beyond dispute is the broader organizational culture that Lucas built and maintained. The federal investigation that eventually dismantled his operation, led by Special Agent Robert Lucy and others within DEA and NYPD's Organized Crime Control Bureau, documented an organization that had penetrated law enforcement at significant levels, used corruption as a shield, and operated with the kind of impunity that comes from being both extremely profitable and extremely violent. His eventual cooperation with federal authorities, which produced convictions of numerous associates and law enforcement officials, was itself a version of the same calculation that had governed his entire career. When the cost of silence outweighed the benefit, the relationship was expendable. The Hollywood Dick story, told in Lucas's own voice, encapsulates the moral framework of his operation. Theft is a capital offense. The capital sentence is carried out personally when necessary, and the reputation for doing so personally is itself a form of organizational control. Whether every detail of his account is precisely accurate, the cultural reality it reflects is consistent with how Lucas described building and protecting his empire across every public account he has given. His story was significantly amplified by the 2007 film American Gangster, which dramatized his career and introduced him to a generation of audiences who had not followed the original criminal proceedings. Lucas himself remained a public figure in the years following his cooperation with federal authorities, giving interviews that revisited his criminal past with a candor that was unusual for someone in his position. And that served to cement a legend built in equal parts from genuine criminal achievement and self-mythologizing. Alpo Martinez. Alberto Martinez grew up in Harlem in the 1980s and became, alongside Rich Porter and AZ, one of the central figures in what would become one of the most discussed drug crews in the history of New York's street-level drug trade. The story of Alpo, Rich Porter, and the world they inhabited has been told and retold in rap music, documentaries, and journalism to the point where the facts have become inseparable from the legend. But the central event at the core of their story is documented and unambiguous. Alpo Martinez murdered his closest business partner. Rich Porter was, by most accounts, genuinely beloved in the communities where he operated. He was known for generosity, for looking out for people around him, and for the kind of charisma that drew people in without the aggressive projection of menace that characterized many people at his level of the drug trade. He and Alpo had been close since childhood, had built their operation together, and had accumulated enough money and street standing to be recognized as major players in Harlem's drug economy at a time when that economy was generating enormous sums and consuming enormous numbers of young men. The relationship between them began to fracture over money. According to accounts from people who were close to the situation, including testimony and interviews given after the fact, Alpo came to believe that Rich Porter was shorting him on drug profits, keeping money that should have been divided between them, and stealing from the partnership they had built together. Whether the specific amounts involved were as significant as Alpo believed, or whether the calculation was distorted by paranoia or by bad information from people around him, the perception of betrayal had taken hold. In December 1990, Rich Porter was murdered. Alpo Martinez has subsequently admitted to his involvement in Porter's killing, having cooperated with federal authorities in the years that followed his own arrest on separate charges. The cooperation agreement Alpo entered was extensive and generated intense controversy in the communities where both men had operated, because the code against cooperation with law enforcement is one of the most fundamental in street culture, and Alpo's decision to cooperate while having been responsible for Porter's death struck many observers as a particularly complete form of betrayal. The aftermath of his cooperation played out over decades. He was relocated through the federal witness protection program and lived under a protected identity for years. In 2021, he was shot and killed in Washington, D.C. The circumstances of his death, the fact that someone had found him despite his protected status, said something about both the reach of the people who had grievances against him and the impossibility of fully disappearing from a life that had generated as many enemies as his had. The killing of Rich Porter stands as one of the most specific and most documented examples in the history of New York's drug trade of what happens when a business partner is perceived to be stealing from a shared operation. The relationship between Alpo and Porter was not merely professional. They had known each other for years, had grown up in proximity to each other, and had built something together that neither of them could have built alone. None of that mattered when Alpo concluded that the money was being taken. The relationship was not a protection. In a certain sense, the closeness of it made the perceived betrayal feel worse, not better, because it was not a stranger who had stolen. It was his partner. Rich Porter's brother Donald had himself been kidnapped and killed the same year in a separate but related incident involving the dangerous world their family was operating in. Their sister, Donald Porter, would later become a prominent figure in efforts to address gun violence in New York, transforming the tragedy of her brother's deaths into advocacy work that has continued for decades. The human cost of what happened in Harlem in 1990 extended far beyond the immediate principles and has shaped the lives of people connected to them in ways that continue to the present day. The four men in this story operated in different countries, different eras, different types of criminal organizations, and at radically different scales. Zambada built a cartel that moved product across international borders at volumes measured in tons. Lucas ran a Harlem distribution network in a specific, historically bounded moment. Wedding operated a cocaine trafficking network spanning the border between Mexico and Canada. Martinez was a street-level operator in New York whose story became famous not because of the scale of his operation, but because of the human relationships it destroyed. What connects them is the specific logic that governs how criminal organizations respond to internal theft, and why that response is always disproportionate to what a conventional legal or business framework would consider an appropriate remedy. The fundamental issue is not actually about the money or the product that was taken. It is about what allowing the theft to stand communicates to everyone else in the organization who is paying attention. Drug trafficking organizations cannot call the police. They cannot file a lawsuit. They cannot access any of the institutional mechanisms that legitimate businesses use to enforce contracts and address betrayal. The only currency they have for enforcing compliance is the credible threat of violence, and a threat is only credible when it has been demonstrated to be real. When Zambada ordered his nephew killed, he was not making a decision about his nephew's life specifically. He was sending a message to every other person in his organization about the consequence of treating organizational loyalty as optional. When Wedding ordered murders after a stolen cocaine shipment, he was preserving the reputation of his organization as one that would track down theft and respond to it regardless of cost. When Alpo killed Rich Porter, he was resolving, in the only way his world made available to him, what he perceived as an intolerable betrayal by the closest person in his professional life. Frank Lucas said it himself in various forms across numerous interviews. The reputation for being someone who did not let theft go unanswered was the reputation that kept the theft from happening in the first place. The violence was not primarily punitive, it was preventive. It was the demonstration that made future theft a genuinely dangerous proposition. What this pattern reveals at bottom is the specific way that power functions in the absence of legitimate institutions. The rule of law exists, among other reasons, to provide a mechanism for resolving disputes and enforcing agreements without individuals needing to provide enforcement themselves. In the criminal economy, that mechanism does not exist, and what replaces it is the personal and organizational willingness to make theft genuinely costly. The four men in this story were each, in their own context, providing that enforcement and the fact that the enforcement took the form of murder reflects not some unique pathology, but the logical endpoint of operating in an environment where no other enforcement mechanism is available. That does not make what they did defensible. The people who were killed in each of these cases, the nephew who had stolen from Zambada, the individual killed in connection with Wedding's stolen shipment, Hollywood Dick Pearson, Rich Porter, were human beings whose deaths created grief and damage that extended far beyond the immediate transactions that had led to them. The cost of the drug trade is always measured not just in the money that moves through it, but in the lives it consumes on every side of every transaction. What these 4 cases illustrate with particular clarity is that the people at the top of criminal organizations are not simply criminals who have succeeded on a larger scale. They are men who have internalized and institutionalized a specific logic about power, loyalty, and enforcement that makes murder a business decision rather than a moral crisis, and that makes the closest people in their lives the most dangerous ones to betray. None of the 4 men in this story pulled the trigger themselves in most of the killings attributed to their organizations, and that fact is not incidental. It is one of the most important structural features of how power operates at the top of a serious trafficking organization, and it explains both why these men were able to survive for as long as they did, and why eventually almost all of them were brought down by the very people they had once trusted to carry out their orders. A leader at the level of Zambada or Wedding does not walk up to a debt collector or a mid-level distributor and settle the matter personally. The order moves downward through layers of intermediaries, each one insulated from the layer above and below by design. A lieutenant receives instructions that are often vague enough to preserve deniability, phrased in a way that any competent defense attorney would later argue could mean almost anything. That lieutenant relays the substance of the order, not the specific wording, to someone further down the chain, and by the time the instruction reaches the person who will actually carry out the violence, it has passed through enough hands that the original source has functionally disappeared from the paper trail, if there ever was a paper trail at all. This is not laziness or cowardice on the part of the man giving the orders. Dasu. It is a deliberate architecture built around a lesson that every successful trafficking organization eventually learns the hard way. The person who gives the order and the person who executes it should never be provably the same conversation. Frank Lucas is the exception that proves the rule, a leader from an earlier and smaller scale era who involved himself personally enough that his own account of Hollywood Dick Pearson's death exists almost entirely because Lucas chose, decades later, to tell it himself. Zambada and Wedding, operating in organizations built for scale and built in the era of wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and forensic accounting, could not afford that kind of personal exposure and structured their organizations accordingly. The irony embedded in this insulation is that it is also the primary reason these organizations eventually collapse from the inside. Every layer of intermediaries is a person with knowledge of what happened, and every person with knowledge of what happened is a potential cooperating witness the moment their own exposure to prosecution becomes severe enough. Federal prosecutors building cases against organizations like Zambada's or Weddings are rarely working from direct evidence connecting the leader to a specific killing. They are working from a sequence of cooperating witnesses, each one climbing one rung closer to the top of the organization, each one trading testimony about the person above them for a reduced sentence of their own. The same chain of insulation that protects a leader from being caught giving the order becomes, years later, the exact mechanism that puts him in a federal courtroom. Alpo Martinez's case complicates this pattern in an instructive way because he was both the man who ordered Rich Porter's death and, in the broadest sense, the executor of it, operating in a world small enough that the distance between decision and action barely existed. His later cooperation with authorities, providing testimony about people above and around him in exchange for protection and a reduced sentence, was the same transaction that brings down larger organizations, just compressed into a single career rather than distributed across an organizational chart. What this reveals is that the insulation built to protect a trafficking leader from direct legal exposure to any single killing is never permanent. It buys time. It shifts risk downward and outward onto people who have less to lose by staying loyal and more to gain by cooperating once their own freedom is on the line. The men who built empires on the principle that theft must be answered with death were, without exception, also building the exact structural vulnerability that would eventually be used to dismantle everything they had built. There is also a psychological cost to this arrangement that rarely gets discussed alongside the legal one. A leader who orders violence through 3 or 4 layers of intermediaries is, in a sense, never fully certain the order was carried out the way he intended, or against the right person, or for the right reason. Instructions that are deliberately vague to preserve deniability are also vulnerable to distortion as they travel, and a lieutenant with his own grievances or his own agenda can shape what happens at the bottom of the chain in ways the person at the top never authorized and may never even learn about. The insulation that protects a leader from prosecution is the same insulation that strips him of direct control over what is actually happening in his name, which means the empire he believes he is running with absolute authority is, in practice, being interpreted and reinterpreted by every person standing between him and the violence.